Hello everybody and welcome to our discussion of the cost report documentation templates. This is one of 3 videos where we are covering the 3 different templates. This video covers the Medicare Bad Debt specifically. Now first of all, we are going to give an overview of the background of the documentation requirements, and then we will discuss the specific bad debt template. So as part of the overview, back on August 17th of 2018, CMS issued a Federal Register that required that the providers must submit a listing of Medicare bad debts, DISH Medicaid eligible days, GME FTEs, and S10 charity care that correspond to the amounts reported on the cost reports for those various items. So first of all, the GME FTEs, this is basically the IRIS report. So there was already a requirement in place for that listing and for that documentation. So our review here is going to be about 3 things, really. The Medicare bad debts, the DISH Medicaid eligible days, and the S10 charity care and total bad debts. On August 21st of 2020, CMS issued Change Request 11644, which revised the cost report acceptability checklists for that earlier change. Now, I do want to specify here that the instruction in the Federal Register, in the August 17th, 2018 Federal Register, was effective for cost report periods beginning on or after 10/1/2018. Here I have just highlighted an example for the DISH payment specifically, but there's verbiage that the cost report will be rejected if it does not include a detailed listing of that item that corresponds to the Medicaid days or the bad debts, whatever we're talking about here. So the requirement was in effect for 10/1/18 and after cost reports, and then CMS updated the acceptability checklists for cost reports received on or after 12/31/20. If they did not have the above referenced listings, they would be rejected. But what I want to stress here is there was no specific required template for what that documentation would look like. It just had to correspond to the amount reported on the cost report, and it had to be a claim-by-claim listing. Moving forward to November 10th of 2020, CMS issued a proposed rule to obtain comments on the proposed templates, trying to add more substance to what was actually required, what that documentation should look like. June 22nd of 2022, CMS issued a second proposed rule for comments after considering the first round of comments. And then finally in December 29th of 2022, CMS incorporated those changes through Transmittal 18 of the Hospital Cost Report form set. And that's what we're going to be focused on here. They included the new templates and the instructions. Now by template, I want to clarify here, I'm talking about they've identified what columns should be included and what data should be within those columns. They did not require a specific Excel spreadsheet. They're not mandating that you use this exact spreadsheet. They've just mandated whatever spreadsheet you send in should look like. We have built a spreadsheet as a template. We strongly recommend that you use that, but the template itself is not required. Just the fields, the identification, the information from the instructions. So we'll talk about that here. Now the 3 templates we're talking about, actually 4, but 3 different groups, if you will. These are effective for cost report periods beginning on or after 10/1/22. We have the DISH Medicaid eligible days that are Exhibit 3A. Now the instructions and the headings are found at the end of Worksheet S-2 Part 1, which is a worksheet on the actual cost report. All the control questions are listed there. If you look at the instructions, you'll find those. Medicare bad debts that we're talking about today will be found in Exhibit 2A, which can be found at the end of Worksheet S-2 Part 2 of the cost report. That's the hospital cost report reimbursement questionnaire. And then we have the S10 charity care charges, Exhibit 3B, and S10 total bad debts, Exhibit 3C. Those are both found at the end of Worksheet S-10 Part 2. Again, we're focusing on the Medicare bad debts. There will be a video covering DISH and the two charity care, or the two S10 listings. Now, the other thing I want to point out is where to find those templates and the article on our website. If you go to the www.wpsgha.com website, and if you go to the Topic Center, go to Cost Report Audit, and if you scroll down to the Cost Report section, you'll find Cost Report Documentation Requirements and Templates. That's where you'll find the information for the pre-10-122 as well as the 10-122 and after. Now, this video is covering the Medicare Bad Debts section. So as I mentioned, if you go to S-2, Part 2, the Hospital Reimbursement Questionnaire, if you go down toward the end, you're going to see the Medicare Bad Debt template. Now, I want to specify there has been an Exhibit 2 for several years that relates to Medicare bad debts. If you're prior to 10-122, you can still use the Exhibit 2, but if you're on or after 10-122, you must use Exhibit 2A. Now, if you're prior to 10-122, you can certainly adopt this more in-depth template if you'd like, but you're not required to until 10-122. So if you go to this, first of all, you'll see the actual instructions, the actual column headings of the template, and then you'll see the template itself. This is basically what's required. Again, you could use your own Excel spreadsheet and build this yourself, or you can download the version that we've already created. There's a little bit of kind of automation in our version, and we'll talk about that in just a bit when we see that. But again, your spreadsheet should look like this, should be in this order, and the column headings should be either exactly equal to this or very similar. They might have a little more description, but it should be that particular field, and it should follow these instructions for those columns. So now we're going to spend some time going through the template. When you download the template we've created on the website, there will be an instructions tab that go through some basic instructions, again, about where to find the details, and then it'll give you instructions for each of the actual columns. All the way through column 24. In addition, in our template, we've added some informational only columns. They're not required on your template, but they give you a heads up if there are any flags that might result in disallowance of that particular bad debt. So you would either want to correct those issues or at least have a detailed comment as to why that bad debt should still be allowable regardless of the flagged edit. We will come back to this note in just a bit. It basically talks about some of the dates that are reported and when you could actually finally report something off as Medicare bad debt. So we'll come back to this note in a bit. Down here we have automation instructions for this. So when you first download this template, you're going to see these three tabs to start with: the instructions, the bad debt summary, and just one of the potential tabs you may or may not need, just to give you an idea of what the template looks like. Now, the automation piece, as listed in the instructions, it says on the bad debt summary sheet, enter an X in column A for any type of bad debt that you want to generate a listing for, except for the ESRDs, RHCs, and FQHCs, because those are going to be handled a little bit differently. For the ESRDs, RHCs, and FQHCs, enter the number of each type of units in the proper cell in column A. And then you'll click a macro button to add that proper number of units into the spreadsheet. We'll see that in just a bit. Now, you can only, for the input or the insert buttons, you can only press them once. And if you made a mistake, you need to press the clean up rows and worksheets macro button. So let's take a look at that. Bad debt summary. Now, first of all, this orange tab or orange cell is just informational. We need to know what the number of your acute care hospital is, what the number of the cancer or children's hospital is, maybe what the number of the psych subunit is. So that's informational only. It'll flow to the actual tab though. But let's say I have some acute care traditional, so I'm going to put an X there. For inpatient, let's say I have an outpatient traditional. Now pay close attention down here when I do that. It's going to add the outpatient traditional tab. Let's say I also have a psych inpatient crossover subunit. It's going to add that as well. The amounts, once you fill those templates out, will flow over to these cells, and it'll tell you where exactly on the cost report they go. This way you have one nice summary sheet that you know how to fill out your cost report. That's the benefit of this. If you're building your own template, this tab is not a requirement. It's just the tabs that would look like this that are required or similar to this. Now let's go back down here to the ESRD subunits. So let's say we have 2 ESRD subunits. You'd want to enter your number. And I'm going to click Insert ESRDs. Notice how it actually creates ESRD1, ESRD2. But again, I'd want to put in my numbers for those specific ESRDs. Now notice it says enter directly on the listing. Don't enter them here. Enter them on the listing and then they'll carry over here. So the color coding is a little bit different there. Same thing goes with the RHCs. If I have 3 of them, and I click insert, it's going to create my RHC 1, 2, and 3. And it's going to open up all the tabs related to those. Same thing goes with the FQHC subunit. Now again, if I made a mistake, and if I put in 3 RHCs, but I only have 2, then all I have to do is go to this cleanup rows and worksheets. It's going to back out what I just did, and it's going to take it down to just the main ESRD, main RHC, main FQHC, and I can start over there. So that's how that works. But let's go back here. By the way, when you do that cleanup, then you kind of have to go back here and put in that X again. Even though the X is there, it would have hidden all those tabs previously. So now let's look at one of the actual templates to see the detail of what's needed. Now at the very top, you'll see some of the basic heading type information. Some of this comes over from the Bad Debt Summary tab. Some of it is entered. But let's focus on the actual columns. Now, the other thing I do want to mention here is we have the heading columns, similar to what was included in the cost reporting instructions. But then right underneath of that, we have a total column. Now the reason for having it here as opposed to the very bottom is that, we don't really know where your bottom is. How long is your listing? So we put it at the top, and then you can include the detail all the way down to the bottom. And that way it just makes it easier for this. Now obviously most of these columns don't have totals. It's just the very end columns, the allowable bad debts, really. That's the main thing we have that we need the totals for. So that's the format of the template. Now let's take a look at the actual fields. These all match the cost reporting instructions. So we have patient, last name, first name, pretty self-explanatory. Dates of service from and to. The patient account number or control number. Now this one should be your internal number. Column 6 is the HIC number or Medicare beneficiary number, MBI, depending on the year and whether or not that patient has a HIC number to begin with. If that patient is Medicaid eligible, we need to see the Medicaid number. For column 8, we need a yes or no regarding was this patient deemed indigent by the provider. Now, this is not a Medicaid indigence type situation. This is provider deemed indigence or provider determined indigence. So yes or no for that. Now we need to see the Medicare remittance advice date and the Medicaid remittance advice date if there was one. And column 11 is the date that a remittance advice was received from the secondary payer, or if you received a notification from that secondary payer that they were not going to issue an RA, we need to see that date of notification instead. Now, that information is very important later on. Now, let me go back to the instructions here. So the reason these three columns are important is that under the new requirements, timely billing is defined as being 120 days after the later of these three dates. The date of the latest Medicare remittance advice, a Medicaid remittance advice, or some sort of secondary payer. Medicaid in many cases is the secondary payer. But if there was no secondary payer RA, then the notification date. So let's go over here to this timely billing. Again, these fields over here are informational only. But this basically says if your M17, so if we take a look at this, the date of first bill, if that's later than 120 days plus the maximum of these three dates, then it flags as untimely billed. And it would likely be disallowed. If that was the case, it's going to be marked as untimely, and it's likely not going to be allowed as a bad debt. The most recent Federal Register requirement is that it must be timely billed, and that's the definition of timely billing now. So that's why these three dates are important. Column 12, oh, by the way, I do want to stress that both 9 and 10, if we go to the instructions here, and 10, if there was more than one RA date due to revision, enter the latest one. So that's what needs to be included here. When we go to 12, the patient or beneficiary responsibility dollar amount, for example, if it's Medicaid share of cost, we need to know that. So column 12. If this patient is Medicaid eligible, enter the dollar amount that the patient is deemed to be responsible for. For Medicaid, this is the share of cost requirement from the state. But if they are a QMB patient, they are exempt from any Medicaid cost sharing requirement. And in that situation, you're going to enter QMB. If it's a patient deemed indigent by the provider, this amount should be reported as zero. So this, again, is only for Medicaid situations where there's a share of cost. That's what needs to go here. In this situation, when there's a share of cost, even though this patient is a Medicaid patient, a crossover patient, that share of cost is subject to the same collection effort as a non-crossover bad debt. So that's the piece that's important there. Column 13 is, again, the date that the first bill was sent to the beneficiary. And, of course, that's needed for timely billing purposes. Then we get to column 14. Column 14 is when this account was written off against accounts receivable in your own records. Now, remember, this is not bad debt expense. This is when it was finally written off against accounts receivable. We need to know when that date was. And first of all, it does need to be written off against accounts receivable. If there's no date here, this can never be an allowable bad debt. We have to have an accounts receivable write-off date. We need to know if it was sent to the collection agency, yes or no. If it was, column 15 is the date that the account was returned from the collection agency, because again, Medicare requires that the account be returned from the collection agency before it can be allowed for Medicare purposes. Column 16 is the date that all collection efforts have ceased, both internal and external, including any collection effort against Medicaid or other third parties. So this, basically this column 16 would have to be it would have to be after all these other dates have taken place. All collection efforts have to have ceased. And then column 17 is what is being referred to now as the Medicare quote-unquote write-off date. In other words, this is the date that this bad debt is finally eligible for Medicare write-off. It's the latest of column 10, your Medicaid remittance advice date, 14, 15, and 16. In other words, it has to be written off for accounts receivable. It has to have been returned from the collection agency if it was ever sent. And again, all of your other collection efforts have to have ceased. Now, generally speaking, this should not perfectly match the Medicaid RA date unless it was a QMB. And the reason for that, again, is there's generally collection effort against the patient for any cost sharing they had for Medicaid. So up through column 17, we have all the different dates. We've now identified when this bad debt is allowable. When we get to 18 and 19, we're only using these columns if they are actual recoveries. So column 18, this relates to payments made after a bad debt was already written off, even if it's in the same cost reporting period. We need to include the payments, the recoveries basically, but only up to the amount of the original bad debt that was reported and allowed. If that entire bad debt was disallowed for some reason, you would not record a recovery here. Recovery only makes sense if there was a bad debt allowed at some point. It's a recovery against that bad debt. And then on that same note, if you have an amount listed as a recovery in column 18, column 19 should report the cost reporting period in which that account was reimbursed as a Medicare bad debt. Now, if it's this current year, if you've written it off, if you wrote it off, in January of this year, but then now there's a recovery against it, then of course it's going to be this same year. We want that reported. Column 20 and 21, this is the breakdown of your actual total Medicare deductible and total Medicare coinsurance amounts. Now, by policy, these are required to be separate, so that's why we have separate columns for these. Column 22, we want to know of any current year payments before the account was written off. So this is not a recovery. This is a payment against these Medicare deductibles and coinsurance amounts. These are payments that were made, whether by the patient, a third party, insurance, or whoever. The idea here, let's just say that we had a $1,000 deductible, but if somebody already paid $700, then at most only $300 would be allowed as Medicare bad debt. It may even be less if there's some amount still expected to be paid by the provider or by the patient. So maybe we still have $200 outstanding, but we're writing off $100 as Medicare bad debt. That could be the situation there. Of course, if this particular line is for recovery, then this is going to be a negative amount. So if we had a $1,000 recovery and it was written off in whatever period, we would expect a $1,000 amount here. So that's how the template is to be used. And again, there is a comment column for any comments you need to add that would help to explain some of these. If we go further over to the actual information-only tabs or columns, we talked about the untimely billing. The 120-day rule, this means that for a non-indigent, non-Medicaid patient, you have to have a collection effort for at least 120 days. Otherwise, that would not be an allowable bad debt. So the rule here is basically saying if R17, which is our Medicare write-off date, if you wrote it off less than 120 days after M17, which is your date of first bill, then that bad debt is not going to be allowed. This was clarified, codified, and even strengthened in the Federal Register. So this is an absolute requirement now. This info only, this proper day to report, this is basically the maximum of those dates that we talked about earlier, which is again essentially when should this be allowable as a Medicare bad debt. then is this day within the current cost reporting period? So if it's not, then it would not be allowable, with only one exception that we'll talk about in just a second. But normally, if it's written off before or after the cost reporting period, this is going to flag and it's going to say wrong period. This last column is comparing your bad debt amount to the deductibles, coinsurance, and payments. If you tried to write off, well, let's just say here, let's say we had a $1,000 deductible, $700 payment, and then we tried to write off $400, that's going to give us an error because we're trying to write off, or we're trying to report kind of a total of $1,100 when we only had a $1,000 deductible. If the patient truly paid $700, then how could you possibly have $400 left as bad debt? That's more than you had as total deductibles. If we put this down to $300, that error goes away. So now let's talk about that exception. If we go back to the instructions here, down at the bottom, it says an account is not eligible to be reported on a Medicare cost report until the later of the dates in columns 10, 14, 15, and 16. Furthermore, the bad debt is only eligible for reporting in that cost reporting period in which it was written off. The only exception to this is when a provider is completely terminated from the Medicare program, and if there is a new owner, they have not accepted the old owner's provider number and agreement. So it's a clean termination. In that situation, the bad debt can be allowable in the terminating cost reporting period, even if you had to write it off in a later period. So let's say you terminated 11/15, but then you're still going through the collection effort all the way through 1/31, for example. Your final cost reporting period was 11/15. The fact that you did collection effort after the fact is still allowable because it was a terminating cost report. You can report those final bad debts in your final cost reporting period, but that only works when it is a clean termination. If it's a change of ownership and that provider number continues to exist, that exception does not work. They would then have to be written off under the new owner's cost reporting period because that's when the write-off took place. So that takes us through this template. Hopefully this has helped to clarify some of the automation we have, some of the different columns. Just keep in mind you can always find the actual instructions in the cost report software, the HFS software, the instructions there. But we've tried to add some notes into our own instructions as well. So thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please let us know. Otherwise, I will talk to you in our next video. Thank you.